like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. These old things.
All right, Karl Dahl, welcome back to Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing great, Jay. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. You and I have done any number of shall we say, less than topical shows, right? We're kind of get into the weeds. But I've finally finished your book. You were kind enough to give me a signed copy at the OGC conference. And so I figured I'd have you on to talk about it because I really liked it. It was a really good book, both by the standards of our scene and also just generally. I think I sent you a text, actually recommended it to personal friends, which is something I don't tend to do with books made by anonymous accounts on the internet. But
Thank you.
man. So obviously we're going to talk about the book, a little bit about your writing process, but if you could, in kind of broad strokes, could you describe Faction with the Crusaders?
Yeah, thank you. So Faction with the Crusaders it is essentially a prequel to my first novel, which is just simply titled Faction. And the first novel takes place mostly in the 1990s. It's also a first novel. There are some. It's not as the way I would phrase it is, it was me convincing myself that I could write a novel, and then my second one, my goal was to convince the world that I could write a good novel, and I feel comfortable from the feedback that I've gotten that I was successful in doing that. The Faction with the Crusaders is the tale of the elder Joseph Shea, who's the grandfather of the main character of Faction, his entree into the biz of espionage in the context of the Spanish Civil War. And it's also a nationalist sympathetic approach to the Spanish Civil War, which is incredibly rare, especially in English language literature. We can find these old historical nonfiction books where the approach is somewhat neutral rather than being an anti-right polemic. But this tells a lot of the stories that I found while doing research for the book, where I wasn't really sure exactly what direction I wanted it to go into until I sat down and I read just reams of material over a 6-year period, and I said, aha, this is it. And I really focused in on like the Carlist recates and just the everyman story of the people who rose up in Spain to fight against atheistic materialism, aka Bolshevism or anarchism.
Yeah, so big picture, several things. One, and I mentioned this before, you're a very polished writer and you're a very easy to read writer, which is an underrated trait, right? Obviously, I love the Victorians as much as the next guy. But that said, oftentimes sort of economy of prose and writing something clearly is all too rare. And in addition to that, I'll put it this way, not knowing you, I could read the book and probably guess at your opinions, but you do a very good job of not being didactic. And I think that's another common pitfall in our area, right? Is to make a novel that's basically a political tract with extra steps. And you've not done that. You've written a good, readable, entertaining novel. And yeah, I just want to commend you for that. So my thoughts,
Thank you.
Having recently read it, is that to me this book slots into the same role that something like Dune does, where it is both a book that can be read by adults, but also it would be the best like first big book to give to sort of a precocious young boy, right? In that kind
Oh,
of like 10 to 15 range where you're sort of graduating from like kid books to adult books. And in the same way, right? Like Dune obviously is a book that, you know, much ink has been spilled on. There's a lot of depth there. But also for me, and I think of a lot of other people as well, it was our first kind of real book, if that
yeah.
makes sense. And I
Yes.
think that your novel would function very well in that role as well. Where it's like
Oh,
you've got a
thank you.
smart kid who necessarily isn't, you know, into, you know, reading, you know, history or these kind of like dry books. But this is a very good intro to that. And so I realize that might be sort of arrogant to tell you the market for your book, but that was very much what I thought of reading this. Like, I wish this book existed when I was 12 because I would have loved it. And I
You
mean, I
know,
still do, but
yeah, that's interesting. I first of all, thank you. I feel very flattered by that because it resonates with me in that the reason that I wrote it, other than to tell an interesting story, and over time, I should say, my purpose in writing it is to make history accessible to people and elements of history accessible without requiring that they read dry histories or like we were saying before, the kind of semi-balanced having to filter out the difference between, like, here's my box checking exercise of all the anti-fascist statements that I have to make to get this thing published and past an editor and past my like Spanish researchers in the Spanish Academy who are literally like required by law to slander Francisco Franco and his friends. And I think that is an important element to literature. And just thank you. That's I find that very flattering.
well, and I'm glad you brought that up, the sort of ritual required denunciation. Because I was talking with a friend last night, and he's a big David Foster Wallace fan. And he was going back through DFW's nonfiction essays, and he was talking about this one about Nabokov, however you choose to say it, where DFW spends several paragraphs explaining that he wasn't actually a white Russian and ritually denouncing the Tsar. And he's like, "What?
That's hilarious.
Why? Like, okay, you could have opinions, but does anyone talking about Nabokov like are they approaching him as a czarist writer? You know, it's sort of this weird thing, but this ritual denunciation, where even to discuss it, you sort of need to, you know, cross yourself twice, you know, in kind of
Yeah.
a secular context.
Why didn't he
And
stay in the glorious People's Soviet Republic?
yeah, exactly, right. And I think that that is sort of an interesting thing. You see the same thing in discussions of Borges and others, right?
Yeah.
Technically, you know, right-wing figures where they have to be sort of whitewashed and denounced, at least in partial. And so, yeah, I thought that your neutral to positive treatment of the nationalists was quite interesting, especially because you do a good job of humanizing them in the sense that there are a number of different factions at play, some of whom are more sympathetic than others. And a worse writer would have turned this into sort of like a Star Wars-esque situation, right? Where you have this like lovable band of misfits who never did
Yeah.
anything wrong versus, you know, the evil empire. And look, let's be honest, it's relatively close to that, you know, in the grand scheme of things.
It's true. It's true. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do is I kind of fell in love with the Carlists. They resonate with me so tremendously, where they're literally mostly just regular people, guys like us, who are faithful Christians, and they they understand where they're at, and they know that for them they can continue to live the way that, live historically, as Thomas likes to say, which I think is a really great phrase, especially in the context of the Carlists, because they're not some retro futurist, new cool. Here's a really interesting type of politics, man, that you get with a lot of these more niche types, and I think the Falange also are. Their relevance before the war is incredibly overstated by the average person just because of that um pronunciamento where those parties were merged and there was one party in Spain for the right, and it was a fusion of the Carlists and the Falange, and that was because the Falange were a relevant they were militarily relevant and a channel into which the population can flow, as were the Carlist requetés. And so they made themselves punch way above their weight in the post-war retelling of their history, even though they were almost irrelevant outside of their prominence and influence with people who had just had it in the like 2 years before the war started.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting point, right? And I think we mentioned this last time we spoke about the Spanish Civil War. But to me, I always go back to, the movie Pan's Labyrinth, which, casts the Spanish nationalists as basically the mid-century Germans. And I think that that is another part of it as well, is that entire event is filtered through both the eventual victory of the nationalist forces and also World War II. And so, much like looking through, multiple panes of glass, it becomes incredibly distorted as to what actually happened, right? Because it is a part of the sort of state religion of anti-fascism, right? It's not a real event in that way.
And it's also through the filter of media, of what is it, 78 years of media at this point, that distorts reality incredibly. And let's be honest, there were horrible people who allied with the right wing. Some of the landowners in Andalusia, for example, were just horrific in the way that they treated regular people. There's a very famous story of the basically the head of international propaganda for the nationalists essentially got the position because he just raised his hand and was given it, and he would extol he would tell these stories to foreign reporters of how he lined up a bunch of workers on his estate and just shot a bunch of them so that the others would, as an example to the others, which is horrific. And he doesn't even say these people were Marxists or anything like that. Just absolutely no excuses other than to put them in their place. And those people really existed. And the biggest critics of those people could be found on the side of the Falange and the Carlist actual thought leadership.
Yeah, and I think that is, and this sort of comes back to the speech you gave at the Old Glory Club conference, which has recently been published, if I'm correct.
Correct.
It was what we would describe now a big tent movement, right? It wasn't just, Hitler in Spain, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
So to get back to your book, one of the things that you do quite well is your book has an excellent cold open. And this is actually something, and we've spoken about this a little bit off air. I very often get sent manuscripts, and one of the most common pieces of feedback I have is, give me a reason to care. Right?
Yes.
Give me something to hook me early. Because if we don't have that, if we don't have something inciting, unless your writing is absolutely exceptional, I don't care.
Yeah.
Not personally, of course, but I mean, I as a reader. Actually, this is a great example. You see this in The Hobbit is a good example of this, right? it starts fairly slow, but by the end of the day, right, you have Gandalf and the party of dwarves basically saying, this is what's happening. We're going on this adventure. It is inciting. It says, like, this is where we're going. This is why you should care. And yours has a sort of, in media race style action scene right off the get-go. And it's well written, which certainly helps. But you did a very good job of giving a hook at the beginning of your novel. And so I'm curious, right? Maybe we can get into the actual process of writing, because you said this took you many years to put out. And so do you want to speak to that opening a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I would put it is, one of the things that I learned from my first novel was the importance of never assuming that the reader is bought in. You have to keep it moving. So pacing is really important, but keeping it interesting. You don't have to fill in detail. It's not like the laborious process of filling in detail to check boxes to move a story along. You have to keep it compelling from pacing and just the elements of the story that you're telling. And so you need to start with a bang. In my experience, when I'm reading, like you said, when I'm reading really anything, if I'm not bought in the first page, I start to question why am I doing this? And by the end of the first chapter, you have to be like, this is incredibly compelling. I need to keep reading. And so when I was writing it, I essentially, and this is just me, the way I do this, but I have this assemblage of notes, and from a historical fiction perspective, it requires a huge amount of research to not make these simple mistakes of timeline. And sometimes you can be misled by your research material. Like for example, I had a very tiny technical thing that I got wrong that someone reached out to me about in the very, very, very first release of it, where they said, hey, this literally became available the next year, but wasn't available here yet. And what had happened was, in a article that I read about some medical history, the author fudged some terminology a little bit, and that led me to kind of fudge that ever so slightly, instead of being a little more of a stickler in using a broad general word. And so anyway, so you have all these notes of these things that you need to do, and then I'll also put little placeholders in, because like if I have an idea for a scene and I sit down and I'm writing a scene, I'll put brackets around things where I'm not 100% sure on the historical accuracy of something, so that I go back and revisit it. And the amount of editing and revisiting that I do of the text, to not only make sure that everything is historically accurate, but that it flows nicely, and I don't have, for example, repetition of language or terms, requires me to read this over and over and over again and work on it. As my own editor, I'm required to just be completely dispassionate about what I'm reading, and to not be arrogant about going back and making corrections wherever I need to. So I had a relatively, in brackets, like on paper, in my manuscript, I had a fairly linear approach to it. And then as time went by, I realized you can't start the story with, here's our character when he's 18 years old in the United States, right after graduating high school. I needed to think about, how do I want to tell that story? Do I want to jump right out into it? Do I want it to take place kind of in his own thoughts and observations as other stuff is happening? How do I kick off that, what his mission is? And so I came up with this style where we start out almost mid to late point in the war in the first chapter. And then after that, the chapters alternate between, in a linear fashion between the very beginning of the tale and where Joe Shea sets out to Europe, and then jumping forward, and then they kind of interweave until you end up almost midpoint of the book where it just becomes completely linear from that point on.
Yeah, I will say, this is funny. This is actually very similar advice that I gave to John Slaughter in his book, Crimson Veil, which I did not plan
Which is
this, but I
very
do
good.
have
You
on my
should buy
desk.
it.
Right. And one of the things that I was talking to him about that is that, like, if you were telling a story to someone or you were talking, you'd probably go through linearly because it a logical way to organize your own thoughts. But going back to that idea of you need to give me a reason to care, if you're writing it almost like a biography, but instead of being George Washington or Robert E. Lee, where we know why this person is important,
Yes.
you're telling me the autobiography of an anonymous man who I, to be honest, have no reason to care about.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm actually glad you brought that up because that was the next thing in my notes. I think that was very effective structurally because you are both, giving the reader the sort of A plot, which is, Joseph Shea in the war, him doing things. And then on the back end, you're explaining, well, how did he get here? How does he know how to do these things? And so it's very effective in simultaneously not giving us a massive exposition dump where it's like, reading a Wikipedia early life section, if you will, while also not just, dropping a sort of like, John Action Man in the middle of a war and having him just go off to, chew bubble gum and, kick ass.
Yeah.
Right? And I thought that was very, very effective. And one of the other things that I like that you do is Joseph is a very mortal hero, right? Not in the sense that he is, I like that, while certainly it is an exaggerated historical event, right? Like if someone lived this life, it would be crazy. But it is all very much within the realm of believability.
Yes.
And in a way that both, makes it interesting and fits into the kind of historical fiction genre, but also it adds a good bit of tension. And I was thinking about this even in the, the sort of training that you see in that B plot, right, through the first half of the book, that over and over again, his mentors, his instructors are telling him, like, you are not a one-man army.
Yes.
Like, you need to be smart. You need to be well prepared. And, yeah, it was very well done, that. So I'm not really going to do a summary of the book. You should read it. It's very good. But there are sort of different parts I want to address. And I think first we'll do Joseph Shea's training. So for just a little bit of context, Joseph Shea is, a kid from the Pacific Northwest working as kind of a small town, journalist. He gets, basically picked up working in Europe to work for this kind of, shadowy intelligence organization undercover as a journalist. And he goes through some sort of abbreviated espionage training. And so do you want to discuss sort of that part of the narrative a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I based that upon an abbreviated iteration, an early iteration of the training that the British Special Operations Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services, which are both World War II paramilitary espionage organizations, that they provided to operatives who, and the people who created this system largely came out of the Shanghai Municipal Police. In gun circles, Sykes and Fairbairn are very famous for having done this, but there was all kinds of other training layered on top of it. It wasn't just pure, like, distilled hand-to-hand combat, knife and small arms. That was a very small part of it. And the premise also is that leading up to the war, the British were bought in on there being, planning for World War II, really since 1933, essentially. So as soon as Funny Mustache Man ascended, the British were like, "Oh, we're going to have another war," and there were elements of this kind of training and operation taking place at that time. Now, most of the time, a person involved in espionage in the service of the British or the Americans even would literally just be like a military veteran who worked in business and had some, guidance as far as, this is the kind of information that we want to get. So they would have this kind of natural maturation of their skill set. But when you're training people, you have to give it to them in this distilled fashion. And so that's what I designed that based on, which is like, this is ultimately what they ended up doing. And they're kind of in the skeleton of where these schools are being built. And he's one of the first people to go through this pipeline. Because that sort of thing did happen. They were doing this. The British were doing these kinds of operations in the 1930s. And the American intelligence really came out of the British intelligence organizations. William Donovan, who shows up later in the story, was essentially plugged right into this British intelligence network, and I call it the kind of jokingly the Anglo-American Press Agency, because wink wink, that's really how it did work. And so the British had never planned anything other than to drag their American cousins right into World War II.
I'm glad you used that phrase, sort of wink wink, because if you are of a, shall we say, a revisionist bent, there's a lot to pick up on in this book. There's a lot of noticing that can be done. And again, you were not didactic about it, right? You sort of have to know. But if you know, there are many themes unstated, at least directly. I'll perhaps leave it at that. But yeah, I found the training to be, very interesting and compelling. Again, because I mentioned it does sort of justify our character's role in this book. But also because, again, there's sort of this dynamic that he was never supposed to be a war hero, right? He was supposed to be, very sort of clandestine, right? Observing, passing things along through both, should we say, like exoteric and esoteric, methods, right? Maybe not quite the right word, but we'll go with it. And is sort of dragged into the war. So there's a great, I guess you would say, like scene or group of scenes based around a hotel sort of behind enemy lines in in Republican Spain. One of my favorite notes, and I think you'll probably remember this, Carl. I was texting you my different notes as I was going through.
Oh yeah, that's right.
One, just to prove you that I actually read the book, and two, that it is kind of fun. This is like I'm gonna check my privilege, if you will. It is kind of cool to be able to just text the guy who wrote the book that you like. But you sort of send shots at Hemingway, just kind of offhanded. But do you want to talk about, that hotel, the scenes around it, and then how, Joseph Shea is sort of pulled into the action directly when he is, brought to, let's just say, a detention facility?
Yes. So to be candid, I was considering having Joseph Shea murder Ernest Hemingway early on, just because I personally dislike Hemingway quite a bit. I do. You and I have talked about it. I really like his writing style. Or I have liked and enjoyed his writing style in the past, but in many ways he's just a very loathsome tool of leftist propagandists, and especially in the context of the Spanish Civil War. But I felt, as I considered it, I was like, no, that's a bit much. That's pretty absurd. And so then I thought, could it be someone who's like a stand-in for him? And I was like, no, that's ridiculous. I'll just take shots at him. So the long and the short is that the Hotel Florida in Madrid, particularly in the first half of the Spanish Civil War, was the hub for, foreign journalists in particular, as well as, foreign kind of like political operatives and folks of that nature. It was a very, modern at the time hotel in Spain, and was very comfortable and became really where all the journos and those types of folks rode out the war. And over time it became almost like a prison for them too, in that they were on tracks because of the nature of the war. The Republic was essentially coming in and saying, okay, now write your stuff, and then they would review their material and then allow them to send it out, with redactions and the like. Redactions in the original sense, not the modern like shooting people sense. And then they would
Although
take
that
them
came
out
later, right?
Yeah, although that did come later. And then they would take them out to battle sites and like tell them what the narrative was. And so you have all these people that are basically imprisoned and just drinking constantly. And Ernest Hemingway was very rapey of the staff. And but that was permitted because, again, here's this big wheel giving good, free promotion and good optics to the Republican side. And so it makes it a really interesting place to be, where you're kind of trapped there, and the war is going on all around you. And yes, aerial bombing is taking place. You can, earlier on, you can venture out on your own, but you're just constantly being watched. And it makes this fun kind of little pressure cooker of an environment. The Cheka, which is the basically torture, the torture prison that he goes to later, was a real place. And when I was writing and it was kind of a semi unofficial place that the Republic actually did, to their credit, shut down, because it was basically a place where the smallish faction of the most extreme communists and anarchists, who really were just all about torching Spain and getting rid of, all class enemies and the like, were just in excruciating detail, just violating any sort of legitimacy that they might have held, to the point where it was endangering the war effort. And yes, it was in an old monastery that is still there, and you can go to the place. I believe it's a monastery again, but it's this very grim sort of place because of what took place there. So the thought of marching into one of these Chekas, which was again named after the kind of slang term for the NKVD torture agents, was very gruesome, and would be definitely not a place that you would want to get dragged into without having weapons.
Yeah, and the scene where Shay sort of busts out of the Cheka is it's a really good action scene. You are quite adept at writing sudden violence, in the sense that it comes across as sudden both to the reader and not in sort of a way where it feels unearned, right? Where there's this sort of slow burn and then all of a sudden everything kicks off, which is, very compelling reading. But I want to go back to Hemingway for a little bit, because, I've read For Whom the Bell Tolls and thought it was largely hot garbage.
Yeah.
It is one of the horniest books I've ever read. It's very creepy. And you sort of get the feeling that you are, You know that meme that goes around that like this episode starring the writer's barely disguised fetish?
Yes.
That's sort of the feeling you get from that book. And it's funny because if you had not knowing you, not knowing the book, if you had just given me a sort of, inside of the jacket blurb, right? It'd be like, oh, this is just a mirror image of For Whom the Bell Tolls. Because, on the face of it, they share certain attributes, right?
Sure.
An American fighting in the Spanish Civil War. But they're very different books because this book does have a romantic plot in it. But it is not at all kind of creepy in a Hemingway-esque fashion. And so, one, I want to applaud you on that. And then two,
Thank you.
did you sort of how do you view your work in relation to Whom the Bell Tolls? Because I would argue that is sort of the most famous cultural output
Yeah.
from that war. And, technically, right, there is certainly, shared I want to say content, but like a shared
Theme.
sort of motif, theme between
Yeah.
the two. I mean, even down to the point where it's like there's a large segment of this book, your book rather, that revolves around kind of like tankettes and armored cars, which if you've read, For Whom the Bell Tolls,
Yeah.
that, obviously makes shall we say, a dramatic final appearance at the end of the book.
Yeah.
So yeah, how did you, view your work in relation to Hemingway's?
My goal was to not write anything that could possibly be confused as related to Hemingway's.
Fair enough. I don't blame you.
And it's because, as you point out, that's one of the difficulties is that's a primary cultural touch point. But I can't write a story from the perspective of a Spaniard. I can write a story on a perspective of an American, an American born, 70 years before I was born. But at the same time, we have these common cultural touch points. And I kind of modeled Joseph Shea and his tendencies and like his mother's tendencies and things of that nature on people that I knew from kind of that generation or the generation immediately afterwards. There's you don't know it, but both of my grandfathers show up in this book, and that I tell little tiny stories, like the cabbie talking about his brother, who was named after their Greek neighbor's son who died in World War I. That's my grandfather, my paternal grandfather. And so there's things of that nature that I wanted to tell, and I really wanted to tell these stories, and find a feasible way to do it. And again, the goal being that if someone read For Whom the Bell Tolls and this book, they would say, this doesn't take any inspiration from Hemingway whatsoever.
I mean, it as someone who is literally in that position, that was my takeaway as well. It's sort of unfortunate in the sense that these books will be compared because of
Yes.
There's just not a lot of English language. I guess would you consider For Whom the Bell Tolls historical fiction? I mean, I guess, but the broadest possible.
Yeah.
Technically, I guess it is.
It was a polemic. I mean, it's like you
Yeah.
were pointing out, For Whom the Bell Tolls is a polemic in the same sense that, a lot of stuff that our guys write are polemics, where it's just beating you over the head with a cartoon version of a perspective. And I can't do that. I had to talk about the real problems on both sides, and the fact that there was more than two sides really is one of the key things, and the factional disputes and the personality conflicts driving an awful lot of this stuff. There's one or two points where I'm deliberately slightly cartoonish, like the when the anarchists are struggling against the communists in Aragon, kind of early on, I made the communists deliberately cartoonish, and that's because, the right thing to do with those people is to put them into mass graves, with a permit, of course, but paperwork has to be all sorted out and it has to be lawfully legal self-defense. But that's where I allowed myself to indulge in that sort of a thing. Everyone else is, as much as I could, like a feasible character, or like a version of a real person who was there at that time, because you just really have to avoid that stuff. It's fun to dip your toes in it for a little bit of, flavor, but you really have to try to step away from the polemic.
Well, especially in a work that is, by its genre, sort of multifaceted.
Yeah.
Right? It is not merely an adventure story. It is not merely a historical description. Right? It is a blending of those two. And so this is something that you did a quite an admirable job balancing both the fact that you will learn history from this book, but I never feel like you are lecturing me, which is helpful because in the job that Joseph Shea does, where he is effectively preparing intelligence for an external reader, right, in the confines of the narrative, is actually quite helpful because it makes sense that he would be noticing these things. He'd be recording these things.
Yeah.
It's his job. And so, you and I, shall we say, share a neurochemical imbalance that leads us to be very interested in, firearms and small arms. But even if you don't have that, it's still interesting and compelling. And there is a justifiable narrative reason for why our character is, noting and talking about these things, right? It is his job to do so.
Yes.
And to your point about, writing your characters as people, I actually think that one of the best versions of this, and again, not summarizing the book, you should read it, but sort of the driving plot of, should we say, the second half of the book, is a sort of long rescue mission behind enemy lines. And they rescue sort of a handful of women, some of whom are, related to, powerful and political people, including our main character's, love interest. And each one of those women sort of represents, and I'm not, again, trying to put words in your mouth here, but they represent sort of different people swept up in the Republican cause.
Fair.
And so you have a spectrum of just kind of go along to get along types, starry-eyed idealists who've now been very cynical, to people who are very much still bought into anarchism and yet forced to face with the grim reality of, the kind of Soviet control of the Republican Army. And I thought that you did very well there. So do you want to speak to those characters perhaps?
Yeah, the way I would, this might sound odd to people, but when I'm writing a story and I have characters, they become real people in my mind. Not that they're speaking to me, but it's, as I think about this, I see them and I know I sympathize with them, like on a spiritual level. Christian love is a great guide for having sympathy for people who are wrong. And there's very few evil cartoon characters. There are evil cartoon characters out there. Evil's a real thing. I firmly believe in it. I think the spiritual is a really important element to this. But most of the time, the people that get swept up in these things, particularly women, are there because that's what's all around them. And in having that Christian love and that sympathy for people's mistakes and misguidedness, and compassion towards them, that allows you to write them as a real person that can demonstrate like the kinds of people that are on the other side of your sights, frankly, in a war. And a lot of them aren't going to be able to hurt you, especially women, right? That's one of the things that plays out is early in the war, they were arming these, militant females, and they were just not, isn't it shocking that, 21-year-old girls are not cut out for trench warfare, like sitting in the mud for 9 months.
Carl, how dare you? How dare you?
This is all my way of saying girls are cute and we should pat them on the head when they have ideas.
Well, look, I've been reliably informed from Ukrainian news that OnlyFans models are killing dozens of elite Spetsnaz troopers uh, via drone warfare
Yeah.
and shotguns they got from their grandma. So I really don't know what you're basing that opinion on.
Yeah, it's funny. There if you look online and you look at you know, Spanish anarchist militia, like a good 40% of the pictures that come up are like cute girls with a Mauser slung over their shoulder, and you're like, that's nice, because that completely disappears within the first couple of months. They end up working in the kitchens and being comfort girls, and not a pleasant fate for them. And so I try to obscure um, the gory details, as it were, from a lot of those things, but I hint at them with some of those gals, and I don't know. I think girls are cute, and I don't want bad things to happen to them, and so I sympathize with them when they end up in bad situations.
Well, and to your point, you do a, and this is why I said this would be a very good book for kind of a precocious boy, because there is obviously a lot that can be gained from reading it as an adult. You pick up on the things you were talking about, the sort of implied gory details, but I mean, basically, it's if it were a movie, it would be PG-13, right? Like there's some violence, a little bit of, I mean, I feel very gay saying it like this, but a little bit of bad language. But it's definitely something that is not age inappropriate. But you're not pulling punches. You're not pretending it doesn't happen. You're just leaving things softly stated, which I think is it shows restraint, which I think does you service.
Thank you. When I was writing this, I didn't want to write it in the style of a 1930s novel, but I wanted it to be feasible language, and I really wanted to be sure that I wasn't almost like code switching between like modern writing styles and conventions, and that kind of telling a retro story. Like you can do that in the 24 episode anime adaptation where you have the music video compilations at the end with modern music, but you can't do that in the novel or it takes people right out of it. So I think back, and I mean, my own father, who's a boomer, I heard him swear once in my entire life. My grandparents certainly not, and they're very low key like criticisms of people. Like my grandmother one time said, well, he's certainly no gentleman, and that was like the harshest thing that she could have said about anyone. And so I kind of filter that because I know that wasn't everyone, but I wanted to maintain that this is a good guy from good people, and it's wonderful that he's slotting the enemy when he needs to, without being like too enthusiastic about just like murder, right? It's it's and that's the way like real people are. We don't all have to descend into the mud to be heckin' valid. Like
Mm.
Redditors and excessive profanity and all that stuff, it takes me right out of it. If I'm watching a movie or a TV show and there's too much sex and too much profanity, it loses me at this point in my life. I just don't want it. I just don't care. It's not impressive. I've heard naughty language and it doesn't elevate you in any way whatsoever. Um, but it also doesn't. It's not like it offends me necessarily. I just get bored with it. It's boring.
Well, and it's something that, and I'll give you two examples here that the kind of like Reddit writing
Yeah.
where and if you've read like Lord forbid it, right? Modern mass market fiction, right? The things that actually does get published by major publishing houses. It drives me nuts because it is, imagine, right, your kind of classic medieval fantasy setting where everyone talks like a 32-year-old college graduate.
Well, that
It's
just
incredibly
happened.
irritating. Yes, and that's the like egregious example, but even the kind of like the speech patterns of the like, the kind of like Reddit profanity,
Yeah.
which is just incredibly irritating. And to your point about, sort of like, shall we say, like depravity in fiction, it is something that has to be earned. And, as a Gen Z guy, I don't watch movies or television. My attention span is too short. And so it takes a lot for me to watch, particularly like an episodic TV show. It's just not my bag. But earlier this year, I watched through in the first season of True Detective, which is one of the very rare cases where everyone is actually right. This is good and worth your time. And it's kind of a fascinating study of earned depravity in the sense that there are constantly horrible things happening, but they are shown as horrible with very real consequences. And so, you compare that to the kind of like gleeful darkness in certain things. I don't want to just beat up on George R.R. Martin, but I'll do it anyway because he's, a fat libtard. Where it sort of comes across as like you're weirdly sort of getting off on just making everything miserable. This doesn't read as real people, right? It reads as kind of an incredibly like misanthropic fantasy, really. And I think that it's not even, you could say, like having X or Y in a piece of media makes it, bad or kind of gratuitous, but it is something that needs to be earned. And to your point about, how would a working class guy from a, religious background in, a rural American state in the 30s talk, right? It would be very off-putting if he talked like, a Redditor, right? If he was, constantly making these sort of, snide remarks. And it is a trap that poor authors often fall into. So Karl, we are fast approaching time. And I just want to say again, buy this book. It's very good. Not just because I'm friends with Karl, but because I enjoyed it. I think I mentioned earlier, I recommended it to my non-political friends, which is, quite an endorsement. But Karl, if people want to find more of you and more of your work, where can they do that?
You can find me at my best spot is Substack, karldahl.substack.com. That's KARLDAHL.substack.com. That's where my effort posts and a lot of my little essays on topics that about the Spanish Civil War that I learned of while doing research for this book. Books available on Amazon, Faction and Faction with the Crusaders. You can look it up by name or Karl Dahl. They'll pop right up. I'm also on the platform stupidly renamed X. You can kind of find me there, Caudillo Dahl, or under Karl Dahl, although I disavow that platform, period.
Well, sure thing, man. Those will be linked in the description. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. If you want the episodes early and ad-free, you're going to have to throw me a few bucks. You can do so on Substack, Patreon, Subscribestar, or Gumroad. Again, Karl, thank you so much for coming out, man. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Lie can't last forever. Good night.